Well, welcome again. I imagine most of you, or many of you, have come straight from the wonderful talk we had just very recently by Simon Parkin on Hutchinson Camp specifically, and the kind of quite surreal and wonderful things that took place in that camp on the Isle of Man. We're going to shift the focus somewhat, but with many kind of related themes and the connections, to music quite specifically. Music not only in World War II internment, but also music as a kind of strategy for coping, if you like, and more, as we'll see, in detention centres in Britain now. On the subject of internment, I imagine, again, some of you also attended the talks, at least one of the talks, on Monday. It is, as you'll undoubtedly be aware, this early summer is the 80th anniversary of that morally murky episode, the British government's decision in May 1940 to collar the lot, to intern the so-called enemy aliens, the vast majority of them German-speaking, almost all Jewish refugees who thought they were safe in this country. Right, so it's also Refugee Week. I think that's also terribly important. You'll all be aware of that we've designed this program of events specifically to coincide with the UK-wide Refugee Week. That, as you'll be aware, also for the most part concentrates on refugees now. But certainly, as I initiated the Insiders Outsiders Festival that ran from March 2019 to March 2020 and then came to a rather sort of abrupt end for obvious reasons, this lockdown has been a wonderful opportunity for me to continue the dialogue, as it were, to keep the subject of the cultural contribution of those who fled from Nazi Europe to this country and contributed so greatly to British culture, but to keep it in the public eye, but also to reinforce that strong sense that I've had from the very beginning, and that I know Norbert and many of my other colleagues share, that past and present are inextricably interlinked, and that there are lessons to be learnt by looking at the past that are relevant, of course, to the present day situation. I'd like to, just before we start properly, also to thank the AJR, the Association of Jewish Refugees, that's very kindly agreed to partner Insiders Outsiders on this programme of events. And I will say now, before I forget, that this is not the end of the story. This has been an unusual concentration in a single week, but we have plans, there are plans in the pipeline to continue providing occasional events through the summer, and at this rate, I suspect, probably beyond, into the autumn, online. And I'm very grateful to the AJR for being part of this. I'd like to also mention quite specifically a brand new project that's just been released. It's a so-called microsite on the Association of Jewish Refugees website, dedicated to excerpts from the wonderful Refugee Voices oral history archive, specifically engaging with the interviewees' internment experiences. So that's a brand new resource that I would urge you to look at. Some very practical issues, gets boring, but they have to be said. You're all muted just to keep the noise level sort of under control. I'm afraid you can't be unmuted, but if you have questions, and I very much hope that you will have questions in the wake of Norbert and Sue Luke's presentation today, please type them as concisely as possible through the chat option that you will find in the middle, bottom middle of your screens as we speak, and they will come directly to me, and then I will kind of relay the questions, as it were, to Norbert and or to Sue. I'd suggest, for those of you who are not familiar with the Zoom kind of protocol, that you put yourselves on speaker view so you don't have the distraction of too many little sort of miniature portraits of everybody attending. And I think that's probably enough by way of preamble. Let me start properly by firstly introducing Norbert, who in turn will introduce Sue Lukes a little bit later in the proceedings. Norbert, who you see on the screen now, born in Weimar in the former East Germany. I won't give your date of birth, I don't think we need that. First came to Britain in 1990, immediately in the wake of the fall of the Berlin Wall. However, studied singing and music in Dresden, in Riga, Latvia, and Weimar, and London. And also was involved with visual arts. He used to curate exhibitions, visual arts exhibitions in Germany throughout the 1990s. It's established, some of you will have come across him before, I'm sure. From 1998 onwards, he's established a sort of very eminent career as a freelance singer, a language coach, a vocal coach, and indeed a project curator based in London. He teaches at the Royal College of Music and also at Guildhall School. And most pertinently for our topic today, he's been undertaking wonderfully important, I think, and fascinating research about the experiences and the legacy of immigrant musicians and composers from Nazi Europe to this country since 2012. Based at the Royal College of Music, it first took the form of a project which still has a very fine website called Singing a Song in a Foreign Land. And concomitant with that is the Ensemble Émigré, the small group of musicians he's gathered together to actually perform the music of the former refugee musicians, the composers, which is very much alive and well to this day. And most recently, still, he's managed, miraculously, Norbert, I have to say, to garner major financial support from the AHRC, the Arts and Humanities Research Council, for a kind of sequel, if you like, a more ambitious sequel to the Singing a Song in a Foreign Land project, which has the less poetic title, I have to comment, called Music, Migration and Mobility, currently suspended, alas, because of COVID-19, but hopefully will be up and running again very soon. Norbert, over to you.
Thank you very much, Monica. And just to check, can everybody hear me? Is that, can you hear me? Yeah, good. So thank you, Monica, and of course also to the AJR for hosting this. And also thank you, Sue Lukes, for joining us later in the event. I am actually on furlough from my job at the Royal College at the moment, and we had planned this week for Refugee Week a performance of What a Life at the British Museum, and it was planned to be happening in partnership with the with Edmund de Waal's Library of Exile exhibition at that same time, and we very much hope to be able to restart our project in the autumn, and also, of course, to put on concerts again, and hopefully it may be turning out to be live stream concerts as well. So watch this space. Refugee Week is very important to me personally. I'm really very interested in the cultural effects of migration in particular, and especially because I am a migrant myself. I'm a EU migrant, a proud European Union migrant, and of course I didn't have any problem settling here in the UK, but it is certainly something that I can empathize with, this challenge of finding a new life in a new country. I remember very well when the Berlin Wall fell. I felt very excited on the one hand, but I also felt that there was a lot of uncertainty about my future, and actually a complete vacuum of identity. And this was also an opportunity, of course, but this is not even close to what many refugees have to go through. And they had to do that in the past and also, of course, today. Exploring the legacies of émigré musicians from Nazi Europe here in Britain has been a fascinating journey and a privilege for me. I'm in awe of their achievements. And despite the many hardships they had to endure, and despite the unspeakable loss of family and friends who were murdered by the Nazis, many of them were able to build amazing lives and inspire so many people around them and make a huge contribution to cultural life in this country. The revue What a Life and its story has been a part of my life for over 20 years now. I sang the tenor part in the first recording of it it must have been around the turn of the century. I can't actually remember exactly when it was. It's that long ago, around 1999 or 2000. And then I also met the Hans Gaal family and the pianist Michael Fryen, who I think is with us today as well. And so we recorded this music then, and we performed it again with students at the Royal College of Music in 2012 to launch the Singing a Song in a Land project, which in a foreign land project, which Monica has mentioned already. And since then, I've put on many more performances in various groups, sizes of groups, but also on the Isle of Man in 2017, which brought it sort of full circle for me. We are also working on an edition of this piece, or we have been working on an edition that we hope to publish through RCM Editions, but that's also been delayed now, unfortunately, with the shutdown, but with the lockdown. But I hope that we very much hope we can bring it out soon. Now, I know that many of you are familiar with the story of internment, but I suppose I ought to give you a little bit of the general context, especially for those of you who haven't been able to attend some of the other events in the Insiders Outsiders series. So in May 1940, Germany launched a surprise attack on Holland and Belgium. And faced with the threat of an invasion and in fear of sabotage, the British government embarked on a policy of mass internment of German and Austrian nationals in the United Kingdom. And the large majority of these prisoners were Jewish and other refugees who had escaped persecution by the Nazi regime and were ready to fight against the Nazis together with the British, who had given them a fairly warm welcome so far. But now they fell victim to the general hysteria at the beginning of the war and to growing hostility towards foreigners fueled by the press. They had to stay in the camps for many months until the authorities had dealt with each case individually to make sure they were not a danger and could be released. Some internees were deported to Canada and Australia even, and one transport ship, the Arandora Star, was torpedoed and sunk in July 1940 with many casualties, which of course made the internees and their families very, very anxious. However, most of the internees were brought to the Isle of Man, and this had already been used for internment during the First World War. And they stayed in a number of camps spread out over the island, mostly in terraces of then disused boarding houses, which had been cordoned off with barbed wire. The organization of the camps was very poor initially, but the internees soon developed a hierarchy of self-administration to improve the conditions and to deal with issues including food supply, communication with families outside, which was actually heavily restricted, or the access to medical services, for example. The camps also developed programs of lectures that came to be called universities, and as some of the finest minds of Europe were present, this was a really incredible opportunity for many to hear those wonderful lectures. The composer Hans Gaal became a leading member of the arts committee in the central camp in the capital Douglas. And after several successful concerts of classical music, it was decided to put on a revue for light entertainment to cheer everyone up. It was the brainchild of the Austrian film director Georg Höllering, who had worked with Bertolt Brecht on the film Kuhle Wampe in 1932. And Höllering asked Gaal to compose the music for it and called it "What a Life!" exclamation mark. Gaal wrote the music from his bed in the camp hospital, where he was suffering from a severe skin allergy. He was awaiting his release any day as a case of medical hardship. When it finally came, Gaal asked to be allowed to stay an extra day so he could conduct the second performance. The camp commander found this very sportive and gave his permission. Both sold-out performances took place in the Palace Theatre in Douglas, a large venue with a proper stage and orchestra pit. We estimated it seated about 2,000 people. So while it may not have been entirely full due to some restrictions, but it was a sizable audience for both those performances. The first performance on September 2 was followed by a substantially revised and extended second performance on September 26. Höllering, an experienced film producer, had succeeded in involving countless volunteers in a quick succession of varied tableaus and group scenes with stage designs interspersed with scenes in front of the curtain. There were two compares, one speaking German and the other one English, and two main singers, a baritone and a tenor. Now, unfortunately, the spoken dialogue, the scenes that were, I think, probably extemporized to some part as well between the musical numbers, they were never written down, or the script doesn't survive. So all we have are the actual songs and the instrumental numbers from Hans Gaal's manuscripts. And of course, the wonderful diary, Music Behind Barbed Wire, Musik hinter Stacheldraht. Now, this was published in English in 2014 by Toccata Press in London, and I very warmly recommend this book. It's incredibly well written. I hope you can all see the cover here. So this is the main source of information we have about the review, and we've been able to reconstruct a kind of there is an order of songs because there were numbers in the manuscripts, but I've used excerpts from the diary to tie the musical pieces together and sort of give you the context of the musical numbers in the review. Now, I've been wondering really why this piece has stayed with me for so long. I mean, I've performed a lot of music in my time, and it's been one of the pieces that have never gone away. And there is something really utopian about the story of this review. The project of putting this on under these circumstances and with so many people from so many different backgrounds really transcended boundaries of class and generations, and also of geographical background. So it was a utopian society for a short time. And Hans Gaal, in his diary, he refers to this as he sails away from the Isle of Man after the second performance. He writes in his diary, and this is a translation by Gaal's daughter, Eva Fox Gaal. After the performance, there was a celebration with the usual speeches and replies. None of us said what we were really thinking, that through the community of our life here, our life here had acquired a new, nobler meaning, that all of us have discovered something new and beautiful. We have replaced the bookkeeping of civilized life, where giving and taking are always scrupulously calculated and balanced, by a new principle, according to which each one gives what he can and takes what is offered, without thinking about it. And all of us have felt enriched by it, have enjoyed the warmth, the atmosphere of friendship and comradeship, such as we have never known before. The other really fascinating element of this review for me is the fact that it is bilingual. So in the context of migration, of course, language is so important. And this bilingual work created a sort of common middle ground space between the German refugees and internees and the British authorities, the captors and the captives. And they were all included in this effort to cheer everybody up and make fun of this rather disconcerting and very unpredictable situation they were in. So who was Hans Gaal? Now, there's a whole world to this composer, of course, and I can only touch on some elements here. But he was born in 1890 near Vienna, and he went on to study with Eusebius Mandaszewski, who was a close friend and collaborator of Brahms, and he very much grew up in this school of 19th century composition in Germany at the very highest level. And he was eventually appointed the director of the conservatory in Mainz in 1929, after many years of having his symphonies, his chamber music, and also his operas in repertory in many German theaters and concert halls. When Hitler came to power in 1933, he was instantly dismissed from his position in Mainz, and he returned to Vienna. And again, he was forced to flee when Austria was annexed in 1938. And he emigrated to Britain and settled eventually in Edinburgh, where he died in 1987. So he remained active there for such a long time after the Second World War, and he wrote more than half of his entire oeuvre in Britain. And he was involved in the foundation of the Edinburgh Festival, and he also taught at Edinburgh University. I very much recommend the website hansgaal.org, which is run by the Hans Gaal Society and the family. And there's so much wonderful information there if you would like to learn more about Gaal. But I would like to just play a very brief clip from the opera Die Heilige Ente. Now, this is a sort of Turandot-like sujet, and it was first performed in 1923 in Düsseldorf, and has recently been revived by the Opera House in Heidelberg in Germany. And actually there were several performances of that run of this new production, but unfortunately, of course, some of this also fell victim to the lockdown and to COVID-19. So I think it's a great event for the revival of Hans Gaal's music, really, that this was achieved. And so we can just watch a short clip from this opera. And this gives you an idea of the sort of orchestral scale of his music, of course, and also the kind of musical language that this composer had developed. So Hans Gahl was used to a big orchestra and to major stages to put on his pieces. But of course, for What a Life, for this review in the Palace Theatre, which had a proper orchestra pit, but he had just a group of string players, perhaps just a string quartet, a flute, a clarinet, and a piano. And most songs in the review What a Life were inspired by the actual life in the camp. And so it gives us an insight really into the sort of everyday experience of refugee life in this internment on the Isle of Man. And perhaps this can provide a bridge to talking about detainment of refugees today when we speak we speak with Sue Lukes later on. So the first song, I just want to give you a few songs and just sing a few lines from them really to give you an idea of what sort of music was created. And it's really quite unique. It's very much of its time and of its context, but it is a beautiful way to get an insight into the experience. So the first song is the Ballade vom Dodgson Refugee. Now, the Ballad of the German Refugee. Now, the poster for this review was created by an artist called Paul Humpoletz, and it was an image of a harp playing ballad singer, and his harp was strung with barbed wire, and he was sitting on a crate of porridge, which apparently was the main staple of the diet, and he sings with this harp that is strung with barbed wire. So after the first performance, Höllering decided that he wanted to put this ballad singer on the stage, and it became one of the main elements of the show really. This ballad singer appeared 3 times, and this text, which was written by Otto Erich Deutsch, who later became a famous Schubert scholar, tells really the whole story of the experience they've had, starting with the arrest and then also details of life in the camp. So I'm just going to sing you, to give you an impression, the first verse here, and a special refrain, which I think Gahl may have added later, which actually is the speech of the arresting officer. And so the story goes that on Whitsunday, the sun shone as bright as could be after breakfast's quite modest treat, when 2 friendly gentlemen visited me, and with a car waiting out in the street. And then the arresting officer says, "My dear, good, brave honest German refugee, I really am so sorry that we have to disturb your weekend." And it goes like this. Am Pfingstsonntag im strahlenden Morgenschein, nach des Frühstücks bescheidenem Schmaus, fanden sich 2 sehr freundliche Herren bei uns ein, mit dem Auto bereit vor dem Haus. Lieber, guter, braver deutscher Refugee, leider müssen wir dein Wochenende stören, kleiner Refugee. So that's the Ballade from Dodgson Refugee. So the moment of arrest here in the song. The next moment is really this bizarre experience of being behind barbed wire. I mean, it really is unimaginable for somebody really civilized and having done nothing wrong to find yourself behind barbed wire. And it must have been quite a view to see this. And in this review, the seagulls get to be the ones who are surprised by the barbed wire. And this one is basically says that the seagulls, actually you will hear the text in English and in German. I sing it in German and in English. So I'll start with, I need this. The seagulls are in a curious mood. Maybe they are getting too much food. One thing they all very much deplore is the ugly barbed wire that grows up the shore. So in the seagulls' parliament there was a great debate on that end, and many of them did then inquire, why are human beings behind a wire? Yeah! Why are human beings behind a wire? And in German, die Möwen sehen den Stacheldraht, den man in Douglas errichtet hat. Und weil kein Draht hier früher war, ist ihnen der Zweck des Drahtes nicht klar. Sie debattieren mit viel Geschrei, was wohl der Sinn des Drahtes sei, und kommen zu keinem Resultat. Warum lebt der Mensch hinter Stacheldraht? Ja, warum lebt der Mensch hinter Stacheldraht? So I do believe there is a surviving stylized seagull from this production in the collection of the Akademie der Künste in Berlin. And I have made a resolution to go and actually dig that out when I go to Berlin the next time. Now, just to mention another two pieces that I won't perform, but are so typical. The first one is the fact that it is the quodlibet, and this is a piece that Hans Gahl wrote to show that music practice was going on everywhere, in all corners of the camps, and it was getting such a nuisance. And eventually he composed it in counterpoint. So he had about 10 different tunes, arias, Wagner and Chopin going on at the same time in counterpoint. And he was celebrated for that on his last evening in the camp. And there was a song about the daily exercise, because of course you have to keep fit. So there were people doing Frühsport, morning exercise every day. There was a song about the double bed, which is a very notorious piece from this review, because of course there were only double beds on the Isle of Man in these boarding houses, because they had been used for couples before, and now two men had to share a rather narrow double bed. And there is a clip. I'm just going to show you a short excerpt from that, from our performance at the Royal College of Music in 2012, and you can see that we staged it with an actual bed on the stage. So I'm going to share my screen and play you this.
Das Doppelbett hat ein Tischler gemacht. Er hat sich dabei was ganz anderes gedacht. Denn dass zwei Männer hierrinnen liegen, I'm sorry, davon hat keiner Vergnügen. not too small, but put two men in a bed together. I'm sorry, it is for neither a pleasure.
Sorry, I'm going to stop that. So there is the song of the double bed. So sharing personal space with a stranger. I'm sure that is one of the, the very sort of lasting experiences of such an internment. Now, I have two more songs here. The first one is the Besen Song. So all these men, and I mean, imagine the director of the Mainz Conservatoire, Hans Gahl, and many other eminent people, of course, had to clean their accommodation. So there was a song about a broom, and I brought a broom for your delight. It basically says, it's a wooden thing, this broom, but it doesn't do its work on its own. And then Gahl finds this wonderful dance when it says somebody actually has to move the broom around, and it is actually the human being and not the broom that does the cleaning. So here we have the Besen Song, and yeah. Der Besen macht die Stube rein, doch tut er das nicht von sich selber allein. Er hat keinen Sinn für Wohnungskultur, ist hölzern und faul und gleichgültig nur. Hölzern und faul und gleichgültig nur. Es muss einer sein, der sich da regt. Es muss einer sein, der ihn bewegt. Es ist der Mensch, nicht der Besen, der fegt. So there was a song about a broom, and there was a very important number in the review, which we won't have time for today, but I just wanted to mention it. It's called the Ballade vom armen Jakob. And this is really about somebody becoming a scapegoat. And that's, so it's Hans Gahl in his diary calls it the story of the eternal wandering Jew. But it is really about people, when they get in conflict with each other, just finding somebody weak, who they can beat up and use to channel their anger and until they feel a bit better. And this is really a wonderful piece by Norbert Elias, and I really warmly recommend if you have a chance to get the book, for example. There's a wonderful translation in there. And really the scapegoat mechanism as such, really, that is described by this sociologist Norbert Elias, who wrote this piece, and it's marvelous, and hopefully, well, it will be included in the edition of What a Life that we are going to make available soon. And finally, the Serenade, which is the final piece that's performed by the singers in the review. And this is really about being shouted at. And I suppose that's also an experience that the people in camps will have frequently. And in this case, in this context, it was about the blackout and people trying to read books late at night and being shouted at by the sentries saying, "Well, put that light out," to enforce the blackout. And the two verses in this song, which is very much like German Lieder, very, very lyrical, say basically every night when it's dark, there are these cats that sing songs beyond our windows, and of course, they sing "Put That Light Out." So just before we move on to talk to Sue, and I have one little quote from Hans Gahl's diary afterwards. I'm going to sing you the Serenade. Jeden Abend, wenn es dunkelt und das Meer schon nächtlich funkelt, klagen laut im Mondenstrahl tolle Kater ihre Qual. Wenn in unserem stillen Kampe Leser sitzen bei der Lampe, da ertönt mit süßem Klang serenadig ein Gesang. Put that light out, put that light out, hurry up, put it right out. In the window on the right, I still see a little light. What a nuisance every night. What a nuisance every night. Right, so I do look forward to being able to work with a pianist again once this crazy shutdown gets a bit easier. But here is Hans Gahl's final words after the first performance. He writes that in his diary, and he says this: "We had a happy evening. I knew we would the moment I climbed into the orchestra pit and saw the theatre buzzing full with an excited, curious crowd of spectators. I was in doubt beforehand as to how our public would react to episodes which are outwardly funny, but nevertheless set against the background of our own tragedy, our own suffering and disappointments. Internees come out of their cage into the illusion of freedom, into the theatre. The curtain rises, one sees a barbed wire fence, our barbed wire, our cage. And we ourselves, people like us, enter, poor wretched internees with their little suitcases. Resounding laughter. Two refugees tell each other about their experiences, how they fled from Berlin to Vienna, Vienna to Prague, Warsaw, Amsterdam, Paris, and London. Join the refugees and you will see the world." Resounding laughter. How fortunate that with tragicomic things, it is above all the latter component that the spectators are conscious of. So join the world as, so you will see join the refugees and you will see the world. So this is perhaps a way to bring you in, Sue, and this laughter, this humor, but also the ability to put one's experience into a piece of art like this. And of course, with your work in music in detention, you do that. You give people the opportunity to do that right now. So I'd like to introduce Sue Lukes to you very briefly. Sue, your father was rescued on the Czech Kindertransport by Sir Nicholas Winton. And your work, you say in your TED talk, which I also really warmly recommend to everyone, it's on YouTube. Your work has been around housing aid centers and refugee resettlement and consultancy on migration and equality issues and community development. So you call it the repair business. And you are a director of migration work, community interest company. You helped to set up the Strategic Legal Fund for Vulnerable Migrants. And you are on the committee of the Killala North London Progressive Jewish Community. This is a progressive Jewish community in North London. And you are a Labour councillor for Highbury East and a migrant champion for Islington. So, and you helped to set up Music in Detention as a charity, and you chair the trustees of the charity. So hello, Sue, thanks for joining us. And yeah, what do you make of this story of What a Life? And how does it sound to a migration expert of today?
So yes, we set up Music in Detention. I should have remembered the date and brought it with me, but well over 10 years ago. I mean, you know, every organisation like that has a sort of creation myth, but ours is bound up with some of what you were talking about, which is that originally, I mean, it was set up originally as a pilot project by a very small foundation that I was on the board of that wanted a pilot project that would reach the most excluded migrants in the UK. And we knew those were detainees because certainly then, rather more so now, then very few people knew about immigration detention. We didn't really know what we were going to do with them. The person whose money set up the foundation, who had died, was a very keen amateur musician. And I'm afraid I went to your competitor institution, the Royal Academy of Music, for a concert given by the daughter of a friend who was exploring the differences and similarities between music made in concentration camps and music made in Chilean political prisoner camps, because her mother had been in one and her grandfather had been in another. And I have another more obscure connection with Chile, which I won't bore you with. So I went along to speak there. She wanted a speaker. And then I went back to my committee and said, I think we have something here. Why don't we try and take music into immigration detention? Sometime later, a friend of mine who's a very expert fundraiser for charities said, oh, come on, Sue, you must be mad. You know, you're trying to raise money for the arts, which nobody really values that much and nobody gives that much money to, for the people, you know, that are almost least liked in the country, migrants who happen to be in detention, who everybody thinks are probably criminals. But we have raised money for it over the years and we've kept going. Obviously, at the moment, we're in suspension because you can't go into detention centres because of the coronavirus problem. But essentially, we set it up because we wanted migrants in detention to be able to make their own music and through that to have their own voice. And it's very much about voice because they are largely a voiceless group. People assume that they are criminals. In fact, a minority, a small minority, a smallish minority of people in detention have committed criminal offences. The majority of people in detention are people who have applied for asylum at one time or another. And whose cases have been refused or who've arrived and applied for asylum and been deemed likely to abscond from the process. Quite a significant, about a third of them get released from detention back into the community. And I think one of the things about that is the shame. People don't talk about the fact that they've been in detention because, as any detainee will tell you, if you tell somebody that, they think you must have done something terrible. And so we don't talk about it very much. So we're hoping, we believe that through the music, we're beginning to try and move that on and to sort of lift the veil a little and to reduce the shame by giving people voices. So I don't know if that is enough of an explanation for, I'm sure there'll be questions later on, but that's what we do.
Yeah, thank you. So, and I mean, what do you make of this historical example? I mean, yeah.
Oh, well, I mean, so much of what you were saying and singing resonated so much. I was thinking about it this afternoon, sort of in preparation, and thinking, well, on the one hand, conditions in immigration removal centres, as they're called, are almost certainly worse. I mean, you're not staying in a boarding house. You are staying in usually a purpose-built building on some industrial estate a long way away from anywhere. You will certainly be sharing personal space with at least one, sometimes several other people. And you certainly won't be allowed any degree of autonomy or self-organisation. It's all a routine and a regime and so on. So on the one hand, it feels like that's probably a great deal worse. And the opportunities for things like music making and so on are very, very restricted. But I also think, you know, thinking about my father's generation, I wonder what it would have been like sitting on the Isle of Man with restricted access to news and things like that. Aware of the fact that you're in this unusual situation, but also very much aware of the fact that one clear possibility in your future is an invasion of the UK by the Nazis, which would, of course, you know, result in your extermination. So a lot of detainees are in detention because they didn't give up on their asylum application, because they were worried about being sent home, because they thought they would face personal annihilation if they did, or that they would face extreme danger. So for a lot of people in detention, there is that fear as well. What happens at the end of the process? Will I be able to you know, get my asylum application sorted out in time to actually get back into the UK, or will I end up going home to danger? But I suppose, of course, also the Isle of Man, it was largely, certainly not monocultural, but, you know, most people spoke German. But yes, most of them were Jews. Whereas, of course, in detention centres, you often get 20 or more languages spoken, and communication across those barriers is difficult, which is another reason why music works so brilliantly. Because you can get a whole bunch of people who have not a single word in common between them into a room, and you can get them playing instruments and singing and sharing the music that they have, and it works really, really well. So it's a way of transcending some of the barriers that language and culture can put in your way. But it also means that within detention centres, there are often a lot more tensions between people because there are so many different types of people from different cultures, from different ends of the world and so on, bunched in together, and very little consideration taken of that. I think the sharing space, the being behind barbed wire, of course, all detention centres have barbed wire. And they're pretty unprepossessing buildings if you go into them. I visited Dover, it's now closed, and that was quite an interesting sort of Napoleonic castle, but most of them are sort of, you know, these nondescript buildings in difficult places to get to, with low ceilings and depressing circumstances. I think the worst experience in music in detention was when we were still detaining children and going to visit the children in Yarl's Wood, for example, and thinking about the lives of the children in that detention centre. And there's a lovely, I should say, you can find all the music on the website. If you go to musicindetention.org.uk, you'll find all those songs. And one of the songs is called the Rabid Song, and it's the children singing a song they made up about a rabbit that just turned up in the dining room, they said. It was an imaginary story. And then ran out across the fields. And of course, the rabbit was the children's imagination, running out of the centre in a way that they couldn't. And I have to say, you know, I was there playing triangle on that one. But also feeling desperately sad and not wanting to cry in front of the children. It still makes me cry when I hear the track. So.
Thank you, Sue. I mean, this is incredible insight, really, and I'm ashamed that I don't know more about it. I mean, what is it like? I mean, is there access to education, access to information online? Is it possible to communicate with the outside world for these detainees?
Yes, there are phones, but not smartphones. So people can phone family, friends, that kind of thing, as long as they've got money to pay for credit. They can earn money, £1 an hour, by doing jobs within the detention centre, but that'll be withdrawn from them if they misbehave in some way. And as you can imagine, it's not very much. And that money is also to buy any kind of treats, which include things like toothpaste. So it's a very restricted life. And we go in and do music sessions in different ways. I mean, we you know, the normal pattern is workshops, just sort of workshops where we go in maybe 2 or 3 days in a row for an afternoon and a morning and work with different groups and simply ask them, look, you know, what would you like to sing about? What would you like to write about? And often people have written poems and things like that that they'd like to set to music, or they have an idea about the musical style that they would like to do. And then you work with that. We record the tracks, and we've got lots of lovely recorded music on the website. What we also do then is, where we can, we take that music out into places around the detention centre and increasingly into other places as well. Schools, youth centres, old people's lunch clubs, local, any sort of, a lot of projects working with other people who are fairly excluded, the mentally ill or the homeless and so on, and get them to share the music. So some of the tracks you see on the site are actually put together between those groups, sometimes alternate verses. One of my favourites, I'm not going to let you play it today because you have to go to the website to find it, is called God Don't Make No Junk. And that was an elderly man in an older person's lunch club who had heard about detention. And he said, well, I don't really care what they did because God don't make no junk. And that then became the theme for the tune, where the people from the lunch club and the people from the detention centre you know, produced the song on that theme to a sort of calypso rhythm, really. So that's, I mean, some of the things you talked about, the utopian idea of taking music into detention centres, the idea that, you know, in any situation, music should be there as a form of self-expression, very, very, very dear to me. The idea that it's all about people as human beings having a right to culture, really. And that even in situations like detention, people need to be able to express themselves. And the way in which, by working together to make music, you can express that sort of basic solidarity. And by sharing the music of the detainees, and you can do that too, you know, you can go to the site and share tracks and things like that, then that's also about a basic expression of human solidarity. So,
Yeah. Thank you, Sue. I mean, we're going to listen to some of the music now, but perhaps the last question I wanted to ask now is how long does this detention last? I mean, we on the Isle of Man, people were there from a few months up to more than a year. And how long is the average stay in a detention center in Britain?
okay. We're not sure. It's quite difficult to get data. What we do know is that at any one time, there are about 3,000 places. At the moment, there's only 300 to 400 people in detention because they've actually been moved out in large numbers because of legal action as a result of coronavirus, because the risks to people within those sorts of overcrowded conditions were so great. But at any one time, and then in a year, you'll see about 30,000 people go through detention. But within that, where you'd think, well, that means an average of a month or two each. But there's a huge variation. Some people spend a couple of days, but some people will spend years. There was a famous legal case some years ago that established that 7 years in immigration detention was outside the realms of sort of human rights legislation, that it was too long. Bearing in mind that, I mean, if you're a prisoner, you're given a sentence, you know you can get time off for good behaviour. You can reduce the sentence, you know, you can, and you serve your time. When you go into detention, you have no idea how long you're going to be in detention. Obviously, if you, you know, if you ask to be, even if you, sorry, you can ask to be sent home. That's the way out, if you like, that other than just trying to get back into the community you've left behind, very often with family, friends, and even work and so on. But even if you do, I met people who had a year ago asked to be returned to their home country, but because their documentation wasn't in order or whatever, they were still sitting in detention, waiting for that to happen. So it's a completely unpredictable process. And of course that then really has a huge impact on mental health. I'm assuming with a lot of Germans in the 1940s sitting in detention in the in internment in the Isle of Man, there must have been discussions about mental health, and clearly What a Life touches on quite a lot of those discussions in a way. But what you do see is that people do get very depressed, and they also did begin to display a lot of the physical symptoms of quite significant mental ill health, in terms of, you know, sort of rashes and dietary problems and things like that. So people, I mean, and again, music is quite important in that. We're not music therapists, but we all know that being able to make music, being able to talk about things indirectly through music as well, I think that's what people like. Is there's no requirement on you to talk about detention when you do music with us. You can sing about anything you like. It's up to you. And for some, it's a real relief not to have to talk about their immigration case or the life they've left behind. You know, they'd much rather you know, talk about love and life and flowers and things like that. Others, of course, sing other songs. Mm-hmm.
So you've sent me two songs, and which one would you like me to play?
Well, since I've talked about singing about love, I think if you if you play "Don't Throw My Love Away," now bear in mind Hans Gall wrote, you know, popular music of his time for this. I mean, he was a serious musician and writer, but the songs in there are very much the sort of thing that people might hum on the street or pay good money to go and see in a cabaret or something like that. This is the equivalent nowadays. It's what people, bearing in mind detainees very often in their sort of, they're all adults, so 18 to 30 is the most common sort of age group. This is what young people like to listen to, and the sort of music that they wanted to make so their friends and their fellow detainees could listen to. So Don't Throw My Love Away. There you go. Could
you just tell us a bit about the actual text of it?
I'm sorry, yes, I mean, what I was going to say is that we did it as a residency. We were lucky to get some money to have somebody who actually went into Harmondsworth Detention Centre on a sort of almost permanent basis for a year. And so worked over time with detainees for a long time. And it won an award. We put it in for the Arthur Koestler Awards in 2018 and it won an award there. So you'll hear you can hear the words, you'll see it's a sort of a love song, but it's also sad and reflective in some ways.
So it's about 4.5 minutes, and I'll share my computer sound now and play it for you.
African Caribbean queen. Baby, you say you love me so much, and I seen it in your eyes, oh. And every day I see you, baby, I go crazy. For love is good for me and you. I never know that you can do whatever you say, baby, you be for me. Hey, yeah, step into the one, step into the two, baby. You love me so crazy, I love you too. You are my Afro-Caribbean queen. I'm moving from the north and south, love by Kitty Bosonic and say you wanna be mine. Oh, glory be blessing. You are the queen to an African king. Girl, don't throw my love away. You know I love you. Without you by my side, I love nobody. Girl, don't throw my love away. You know I love you. Without you by my side, I love nobody. 1, 2, 3, baby girl, well, I'm loving you like never before. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Baby girl, you know the feeling I'm having for you. Yeah, yeah, yeah. My baby, my African queen, my baby, the holy one sing. You are my one and only, my sugar in the tea. I say you're my one and only, the sugar in my tea, my African queen. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Ooh, yeah, yeah, yeah. Baby, come my way, way, way. I will show you the way, way, way.
You can be my queen, I'll be your king. We can live our life on a maximum thing. Because I love my Nigerian girl with big body thing. Girl, I need you by my side. Your love made me high. I've never been so high. Baby girl, you're so fly.
Girl, don't throw my love away. You know I love you. Without you by my side, I am nobody. Girl, don't throw my love away. You know I love you. Without you by my side, I am nobody. So a mystical journey from Balada. I give you all a love I got. A mystical journey from Africa to the United Kingdom. I found my baby in the UK. She's an Afro-Caribbean queen. Say you are mystical, baby. You gave me love. You made my heart tumble, tumble. Hey, I don't to Mr. Tumble. Every day you say you wanna go, but now I know that you are my one. Because from you from above for me. There you go, you give me anything I need. You say you wanna make me the man around. Hey, you created the king in me. I'm an African queen, baby girl, you can see this. I'm a loving you, no time of the cities. No be lie, I'm a loving you, my baby. No be lie, say I'm loving you, my baby. You are the bread of my tea, baby. Loving you like the killing, killing. I take you link to star. How I'm gonna warp you home, my baby. Girl, don't throw my love away. You know I love you. Without you by my side, I am nobody. Girl, don't throw my love away. You know I love you. Without you by my side, I am nobody.
There you go. So you
Thank you
can
so
see
much.
there the mix of people. You know, there's dancehall in there from Jamaica. There's African, obviously, and sort of the main tune is covered by that, and lots of rap. I mean, you know, there's less in that song than in others, but we do get a lot of rapping, although we tend not to leave so much of it on the site, as it sort of tends to be people sort of reciting poems that they've done. So you get some idea of what happens in those sessions. There's a lot of different people from a lot of different places putting that together, talking about some fairly heartfelt emotions about leaving people behind and feeling left behind and worried about what happens while they're in detention.
Wow. Well, thank you very much. I wonder, perhaps we should open this conversation up at this point. We could play some more music, but maybe we can take some questions. And hopefully Monica has already got some. Yes, so we're ready to have questions, please.
Very good. Thank you very much, Norbert. Thank you very much, Sue. I have a few questions, but keep them coming, as they say. Let's start with one very practical one. Does music in detention, Sue, need permission to go into the detention centres? Are there any detention centres in London? I think that reveals the level of ignorance that I suspect most of us rather shamefacedly are feeling after your talk.
Okay, we do need permission, and we don't always get it. Yarls Wood, for example, decided that they didn't want us anymore after a while. I mean, interesting. We'd had a lot of discussions with them about the content of some of the songs, about, you know, their sort of the emphasis on people wanting to be free, and then the sort of the director of the centre sort of rather lost his enthusiasm for us. So we only have the resources to get into a few anyway. Are there detention centres in London? Yes, there are 2 at Heathrow. There's 1 at Gatwick. I mean, most of this, I think all the detention centres apart from Dungavel in Scotland are sort of focused on the southeast because, of course, that's where the airports are. I mean, the administrative myth of detention is that they are the departure lounge, really. You know, they're people, you're not meant to be able to detain people unless you are on the, you know, in the process of removing them from the country. They have to be removable, and then, you know, and they have to have exhausted their options for staying legally or whatever. But of course, most people, I mean, as I said, 30% don't get removed. They come back into the, you know, into the country having been detained for any length of time. So they tend to be sort of focused. There's, I mean, there are 9 altogether. Can't list them all, but there's 1 in Lincolnshire, there's 1 in Oxfordshire. We used to have 1 in Portsmouth and 1 in Dover. They've both now been closed. Sorry, there are 2 at Gatwick as well. I should have said Brookhouse and Tyndale. So yes, if you wanted to visit them, there are detainee visitor groups where visitors can go and just, you know, talk to people who don't have other visitors to come and talk to them. And if you wanted to get really involved with us as a volunteer, we're sometimes able to take volunteers in to carry the bags of the musicians and help set up and things like that. So you'd be very welcome to talk to us about that.
I have a very specific question from somebody called Charlotte. Can one get a copy of the wonderful song you just played for us? I'd love to share it, please. Is it online?
Yes. You go onto our website, musicindetention.org.uk, and you'll find all the songs there. So if you look up, you can put them in by title, or you can just scroll through and find the other ones that take your fancy. That one was called Don't Throw My Love Away. So you just look it up on the website, you'll find it. And you can download the tracks from there as well and send them on if that's the way you do music. We do have CDs as well. And if you contact us through the website, you can ask us about whether it's on any of the CDs that we've got available. We tend to send the CDs back into detention centres so the music gets shared with other people there and they can see what other people have done.
And a question from Fiona: how do musicians apply to be involved in music in detention?
You email us. It's that easy. We employ all our musicians on a sort of sessional basis. And if you have the talent, we're interested. You have to be somebody who's used to being what I'm told is called a community musician, somebody who can't just play, if you like, but can get other people involved and can stimulate them creatively.
Very good. And from somebody who's only a number, not a name, did Gal, this is for you, Norbert, and did Hans Gal meet or have any opportunity to work with the Amadeus Quartet then or indeed later?
Well, I'm sure they must have been, must have crossed paths on many occasions. I can't actually, you know, pinpoint a specific moment from their encounter, but you know, Gard was involved with the Edinburgh Festival, and the Amadeus Quartet was there as well. Mine, the Amadeus Quartet were also interned on the Isle of Man. And in fact, the event that we will hopefully have in a few weeks' time with Andrea Rauter and Alison Garnham, will talk about the Murach internment camp in the north of the island, and that's where you know, Norbert Brainin and Sigmund Nissel and also Peter Schidloff must have been interned. Now, were interned, but I know that maybe one of them was removed to another camp at some stage. So it may even be that that he met some of them on the Isle of Man. But of course, the Amadeus Quartet only formed later on in the late 40s. But it was Ferdinand Rauter who met them there, and later on you know, really looked after them a little bit within the Anglo-Austrian Music Society, which was founded during that time, and the Austrian Musicians Group, which was the sort of the prequel to that. And the internment was also really an important episode in the life of the Amadeus Quartet. And when we were on the Isle of Man in 2017, the artistic director of the Air and Arts Center, where we performed one of our performances, actually told us how he remembered the Amadeus Quartet coming back to the Isle of Man and performing there it must have been maybe the 70s, and you know, being on a plane that was rather delayed in bad weather. But they managed to so they went back there. And there is also a wonderful film on YouTube called His Majesty's Most Loyal Enemy Aliens, where you can see Siegmund Nissel, who was one of the members of the Amadeus Quartet, revisiting the island and telling of his experience in internment.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Any other questions? No, perhaps I could sort of interject here. One is an observation that about mental health issues. I think the uncertainty of not knowing when you were going to be released, not to speak of you not knowing really what was going on, what the internment experience was all about, was a profound source of anxiety and mental, you know, sort of turmoil for the mostly Jewish internees. Simon Parkin, who gave the wonderful talk just prior to yours, actually mentioned the fact, which very much picks up on this theme, that there was in Hutchinson Camp a so-called suicide department, where various people were there to give advice to their fellow internees as to the best way to commit suicide. And one knows also from first-hand testimony that some of them actually had procured cyanide pills to be kept, you know, in their pockets just in case. So I think that, again, we talked about tragicomedy, didn't we? I think, you know, it's easy to react more obviously and more easily to the comic side, but it is the tragicomedy of it that must not be forgotten in all these situations. And I have a question for you, Sue, if I may. I'm very curious as an art historian, somebody who's involved more with the visual arts than with music. Are there comparable projects to Music in Intention that use theatre or indeed the visual arts as a vehicle?
I don't know of any longer term projects. There's certainly, I mean, there's a very sort of rudimentary education that goes on. I mean, there are classes and things like that, although increasingly few. I mean, the detention centre in Haslar had a very active education department. We had somebody on our board from them, but that's long closed. There's certainly some painting going on. And if you go onto our website again, there's an absolutely lovely, I should have brought it with me, actually, I should have been able to check. Absolutely lovely painting that was painted in Haslar by one of the detainees, and when they closed, they gave us the painting, and it's a picture of a session with some of our community musicians, but the session is also attended by friends of the detainee artist, but also by John Lennon and I think Bo Diddley and Freddie Mercury, who've been painted in there as well. But what's lovely about it is that it's a session, and then behind the detainees doing the music are the walls, and the walls are dissolving as the music is played. And he said, that's what I wanted to paint. I wanted to paint the feeling that we had when we were in those sessions, that we were no longer surrounded by walls, we were surrounded by music. And that feels like, you know, such an important thing to be able to do for anybody who is in that kind of confinement, to be able to replace the bricks with notes.
Absolutely. And if I can just add something there, I've done quite a lot of work on the artistic activities in the most inauspicious of internment situations, in other words, the Holocaust, the concentration camps, the ghettos, and indeed prisoner of war camps in the Far East in Germany, the Japanese-American internment camps during the Second World War, and that urge to, in a sense, transcend, I use that word with some hesitation because it's not quite the right word, but somehow to, yeah, okay, let's use it, to transcend the immediate situation with all its anxieties and traumas, and use the imagination as a means of doing that. Really does, you know, it's pervasive, it's very widespread, and it's an extraordinary phenomenon. Thank you. We have just one last again from Fiona, a very practical question. I suspect she's dying to kind of participate and collaborate with you. Actually, I have another one coming up. She's asked, how long for and how often are the workshops in the detention centres?
So when we get money for residency, then we put somebody in for, you know, a prolonged period, some months and in one case a year. But generally we do half day, sort of 2.5 hour workshops. That's partly because they're places of routine. And, you know, if you miss your lunch or your dinner, then you don't get anything else. So you have to fit in with the routine that the detention centre allows you. And that tends to be those sorts of things. But we like to go in on several days in succession if we can, 2 or 3 days, because that then gives people time to turn up, you know, do their thing, and then come back to it and refine it, and maybe, you know, sort of work out the other ways in which they want to play it and so on. And then, as I said, we then often do the same in the community in some other place. And if we can, we interleave. So you take the detainees' music out and you go to the project for homeless people and say, this is what they sang there. Now, do you want to respond to it? Do you want to write some more or write a different song about it? We'll take it back in, you know, in 2 days' time. And then you get a dialogue across the barbed wire through the medium of the musician, really.
And looking at the time, I think we do have time for one last question from Dorothea McEwen. And I quote, a very interesting juxtaposition of detention camps and internment camps. However, she's absolutely right, they are more unlike than like. In World War II, the UK had, after all, declared war on Germany. This is not the case with present times and present day detainees.
No, that maybe I can respond to that. I totally agree with that, and of course it's just really the experience of the internment that was sort of something that Monica thought we could put next to each other. But of course we want to be absolutely clear that, you know, that there is a big difference between the historical situation then and now. But perhaps, I mean, it's wonderful, Sue, to hear you talk about the music in detention, but I know also you are, and I must say this before I move on, please, everyone who would like to, you know, express some sort of, you know, appreciation of this in any other way, but then being here, you know, please do consider supporting the charity Music in Detention, because of course that is we've all heard what wonderful and really highly deserving and important work that is. No, but I mean, I was just, you know, we can also get caught up in this, in looking at the trauma and the negative sides of migration and of this history. And of course, it's appalling what people have to go through now, and also what they had to go through then. But also, of course, there are so many positive aspects to migration, and it's really important to remember that you know, people's lives are enormously stimulated by the experience of migration, and also, of course, there are so many other aspects that you know, energizes communities around that. And I just wondered if, Sue, perhaps you can just give us a few thoughts of where we are really now in your experience as a migration expert and an advisor to you know, councils, and also to you know, to cities, and not only in Britain as well, where we are now with seeing the positive side of migration, really, and you know, the Isle of Man experience really in the 1940s was really fueled by the hostile attitude in the press, and it seemed to many that the policy of mass internment was actually just paying homage to this sort of, you know, onslaught of sort of tabloid press, and so where are we with that now, and what's your experience of the positive side of this?
It's a big question. I suppose, I mean, what I do a lot with cities is essentially, I mean, I think, most people who I'm working with in cities, and these are ordinary sort of city officials and so on, accept what academics will tell you, which is that in the end, migration is just a fact of life. I mean, it's been a fact of life ever since millennia ago. Somebody stood up in Africa and thought, I wonder what that is over there. You know, people have constantly migrated. What governments can do generally is not stop it, but they can create the different conditions in which migrants manage. And so really our job is to try and create the conditions in which the fact of migration enables migrants and everybody else to flourish. So that's, you know, sort of what my day job is, if you like. But I think there's an interesting thing about being at war and the use of the migrant as a way for governments to try and shore up their support. And what I would like people to look at is the opinion polls, because it's been a given in British politics for a long time that the public had a negative view about migration, and you couldn't talk positively about migration and get away with it electorally. But actually that has changed. And in the last 3 years, interestingly, there's been a shift from a majority of people, when asked, believing that migration had a negative effect on the economy and on our culture, to a majority of people believing that it has a positive effect. Now, it's not a massive majority, but it's a significant statistical shift. And generally, that's also reflected by a whole range of other polls on people's views around migration. And what's interesting as well is that it's slipped down the list of things that people take into account when voting. So if you like, the political premium on being unpleasant to migrants is declining. And I think there's a lot of different things happening there. I think it became less politically acceptable in Britain and in some but not all European countries to be unpleasant to migrants. I think the Windrush cases have shocked people. People have looked at their neighbours, at the people who they see in local shops, hospitals, schools and so on, who have been appallingly treated and in some cases have been persecuted to death for completely unjust reasons. And so generally the popularity of the anti-migrant stance is declining. I like to think that it's also because of the sort of rather patient work that we do and that lots of other people do, that while at a mega level, we're all sort of talking about migration policy and so on, at a local level, there are hundreds and hundreds of local projects that just bring people together. And that enable people to meet migrants and to realise that they are people with very much the same hopes, very much the same defects as they themselves have. And it's something that has been going on for the last certainly the sort of things I've been involved in for the last 20 years, of that kind of bringing together, often in very simple ways, to cook together, to talk together, to educate our children together. Some of the Saturday schools set up by migrants are now often welcoming children from non-migrant families whose families want them to get on like the children of migrants are. So, there's so many ways in which there's been that kind of coming together. I can't help but believe that eventually that's going to seep through into the statistics, and that's what we're seeing. So I think, I'd like people to go away from today feeling that immigration detention, just like internment, is an appalling thing. It absolutely has no place in a civilized country. But actually, counterposed to that have been the many people who support organisations like ours, the many people who make room for a migrant in their homes, the many people who, settle down to a lovely little club set up by a Syrian lady in, I can't remember if it was Gateshead or Sunderland now, who just set up a lunch club and said we're all going to swap recipes and work out how we could cook each other's food on a council estate, just to get on with it, and because that's the obvious way to find out who your neighbours are and get on with them. That sort of thing is going on everywhere, and I do think that eventually it does pull through into changing people's minds. And I hope that some of the appalling anti-migrant attitudes that we've seen, I think the imposition of quarantine, for example, on the country that has the highest infection rate in Europe, is a sort of way of trying to blame the other for somehow bringing that into the country. I think that is a dying kind of ideological stance, and that people increasingly, the other thing I would say is, when you look at the statistics, I'm afraid, looking around people today, it's older people who tend to have more embedded anti-migrant attitudes. Younger people generally don't. So once you get to that sort of 35 kind of a cutoff, then the number of people who have positive attitudes about migrants and migration is a massively significant majority. And I don't think that's going to change when they get older. I don't think it's a function of age. I think the people who are here today can show us that it's not a function of age to become anti-migrant. It's more that younger people are looking wider and have the world opened up to them by all sorts of technology and things like that, and realise they have a lot more in common with people from all over the world. and their political attitudes and their social attitudes reflect that. So I'm afraid, you know, so long time ago, a supervisor of mine said, don't you think some of the people you work with might find all that optimism a little bit wearing? But I am an optimist. That's why we set up Music in Detention. It was about saying there's a place in everybody's life for that sort of hope and that sort of creation. And I, you know, I don't see any reason for that optimism to be extinguished at this point.
Thank you so much, and thank you. I mean, it's wonderful to hear, and thank you for sharing that and being part of the event today. I really am very grateful.
Sue, one last, it's not a question, it's a comment, and entirely appropriate, from Hilary DeSantos, simply saying, great work, Sue. Thank you very, very much for joining us. Thank you, Norbert, for...
I'm going to say, if we have a couple of minutes towards the end, we could maybe play us out on Song of Freedom, which was...
Yes, great, that's good. So you can...
Not yet,
serenade
because
us
I
out.
think it's only a couple of minutes long, but...
That's right, so I've got it here, so just give me one moment to find it. And then I'll play that for you. And hopefully you won't need to look at my screen again this time. So just give me one moment. So just put freedom in here and I can find it. Yes, so I'll start it and then I share the computer sound.
I think I need to shout out to the chair of Kehilla North London there, who was rocking along with that one.
So I have one last question, because I think we must wind up shortly, from Robin Sampson, asking whether that song was the one written in Yarlswood that caused the authorities to become less keen on your endeavours.
No, it was another one called Liberation, actually, but a similar set of sentiments. Yes, they, yeah, it's a difficult thing to do. It's a delicate process to keep in there, and to keep it going. But I hope from what you've heard and what you'll hear when you go on the website, because there's so many more, you'll think it's worthwhile and I hope that you can support in any way you can. Thank you.
Thank you. Norbert, did you want to wind things up, or shall I just? Yes, exactly. I think we all would clap audibly.
So no, just to say thank you very much everybody for being here. And if you want to follow the Music and Migration and Mobility project of the Royal College of Music, there's also a website, and also my personal website has a lot of information about things as well. So yeah, thank you very much for being here.
And if I can just chip in with one last comment, I think Norbert in fact already mentioned that there are plans afoot for him to be in conversation with Andrea Rauter, who's Ferdinand Rauter's daughter, and Alison Garnham, who's an expert in Hans Keller, again about music and interment, but focusing on slightly different issues. We don't have a date yet, but it's going to be sometime in July. So I do urge you, if you haven't already done so, to sign up to the Insiders Outsiders newsletter. You can do that on the insidersoutsiders.org website, of course, and we'll keep you posted, as they say. Thank you very much, Norbert, Sue, again, and thank all of you for being such a good audience. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you, everyone.
Night.